The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
I met Bryan Goldmark at a cocktail party last year at Podcast Movement. Under the downtown Dallas heat and over a couple of expensive margaritas, he told me about the Locked On Podcast Network. It's directed at those P1 sports fans in local markets. Perfect if you cheer on anything from the Buffalo Bills to the Carolina Hurricanes. Bryan's no stranger to radio. His dad worked in New York, Miami, and Sacramento. And Bryan himself also has experience in sales, once working for the late CBS Radio. He now heads up sales for Locked On. The company was founded in 2016 by David Locke, who is the radio voice of the Utah Jazz. The company was purchased in 2021 by Tegna, which is part of Gannett. Now, in the past, you may have heard me talk about my podcast network, which is a community of content creators who wish to stay independent and make money their way. That's not what Locked On is. Bryan's going to tell us how they do things. And Locked On borrows a lot from what makes radio successful. Bryan Goldmark joins me from San Francisco. Your dad was in radio.
He was. Yeah, I come from a long background of radio. My dad worked in radio since the 70s. He worked at some major radio stations, WRKO in Boston, Hot 97 in Miami. I think he worked in over a dozen markets. So it was fun when I started working in the radio industry and moved to New York. And a couple of people recognized my last name, which was a lot of fun.
So it was back in the day, it was town to town and up and down the dial, but you get to be the kid in the family who does that. What was it like being a kid growing up and knowing that we have to move to Boston or away from Boston or to another market?
I was fortunate that my father only moved us once. I moved from Miami to Sacramento. My dad had the opportunity to take over the cluster, which was at the time Easy Telecommunications. I believe now it's CBS Radio, for a cluster of stations here in Sacramento, which included at the time, now it's KHTK, which is the sports radio station that covers the Sacramento Kings. So I had an opportunity to be very much involved in sports broadcasting from an early age.
And sports is all the rage when you're 18 to 24. Sports radio was something that came of age in the 90s, and you likely grew up alongside of it. And so what was your first job in sports radio?
Technically, my first job would have been an unpaid voiceover for a mother and son getting a booster shot, I believe, when I was about 7 years old, and my dad needed voiceover work in the studio for a client. Outside of that, my first real job in radio was fresh out of college. And Danny Bortnick hired me at CBS Radio here out in New York City, and that's where I was really working at a radio station. It was a hot AC. That's where I got the job. But with the CBS cluster, I had an opportunity to start to sell into 1010 Wins and the CBS sports station out there in New York.
I mean, that's market number one, so I can only imagine how cutthroat that is.
It was definitely a good place to start. My father liked to joke that I was getting my master's degree in New York City in sales.
Give me one story about a personality.
I'm not really sure I have one, honestly.
That's fine. I don't think the personalities and the salespeople worked that closely together back then.
Not at the time. Now it's much different. Now at Locked On, it's a much different experience. We work so closely with our hosts. What we do in sales is so impactful down to the hosts. It has to be one of the most rewarding sales jobs I've ever been in because of the connection that we have to the talent, because of the influence and impact that my role has on their day-to-day lives. It's pretty incredible to see. I spoke with one of our hosts this morning, actually. So we're very, very involved here at Locked On versus my time at Katz or at a local station.
How did you know that time in radio and radio sales was going to, I don't want to say end for you, but transition out of terrestrial radio and into a digital sphere?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to be in radio from a very early age. I was exposed to what radio was back in the 90s and growing up with a sports radio station and going to the Sacramento Kings games in 2001, 2002 when we had our playoff run. I was exposed to the best of radio, and that really encouraged me to pursue a career in radio. After I had some time in local and I moved to national at Katz, I just saw the evolution coming. I started to lean into more of the digital properties that Cats had to offer. Spotify was one of their clients at the time, and I just leaned into it. I connected with the product. I could see the evolution. It's not very often you get to join a heritage medium and be a part of the innovation, see the wheel being reinvented. And that was something that really excited me and I wanted to be a part of. And Brian Forbes gave me the opportunity when he pulled me over from Cats Radio to Westwood One to be the digital sales manager for the podcast network at Westwood One. And, that's when I had the first opportunity to really jump into the deep end.
So when I look at a sports network like Locked On, it kind of reminds me of a sports radio station, only we're going to be everybody's sports radio station. We're going to be available 24/7, but we've also got a much larger clock. It's not like we have to fill 168 hours of the week. It's kind of infinite how much time you can fill. This is sports radio on speed for you.
It is nonstop. And sports engagement never ends either. We like to meet the fan wherever they are, whenever they are. We always joke there's no off season for the real sports fan. I've been a diehard Kings fan, even when they've been terrible for the last 15 years. Sports fans don't turn it off, and we don't turn off our shows either.
So tell me about the recruitment process. Let's say I have a podcast, and the podcast is, whatever market, and maybe you've got an availability for that. How do you bring a podcaster into your sphere?
Yeah, we have an incredible group of people that scout for talent. Tom Lee is our director of talent scouting and development. And I've talked with him about this, what we look for when we're trying to find a new host to either bring on a new show, whether that's a new college show. We're always growing our college network as we add more universities, or we're elevating a current show, whether something happened with a host or we're bringing it on for the first time. What we look for is, more than anything, I think, a passion for their team. Our end goal is to make the sports fan experience better. Our listeners are committed to their team. They are diehard fans, and you have to be that same type of fan to be one of our hosts. There's no passive sports fans in the Locked On network. And so, a knowledge or a history with the team is very important. Lifelong fans. It's okay to be a fan. A journalist or a radio personality absolutely will help you become better, certainly put you in a better position to be a great podcast host. But you have to be a good entertainer. You have to love what you do. You have to share in the wins and losses with your team. I think that a really passionate listener can feel that from the host. And that's what it takes more than anything to be a great sports podcast host, a great Locked On host. Media experience helps, but it isn't everything.
You mentioned recruiting from podcasts, but have you ever recruited straight out of sports radio? Or maybe you check the trades and then somebody's been laid off and, I think there's an opportunity here.
Oh, absolutely. Our network was founded on a radio personality, right? David Locke, our founder, president, he is still a contributor of Locked On Jazz. He is the host. That was our first podcast, Locked On Jazz, and the network grew from there. Absolutely, we're looking for those opportunities. There have been a lot of changes as of late in the local sports coverage space. Certainly opens up a lot of opportunities for elevated talent.
What's the compensation like? Because when you and I spoke in Dallas over, I think it was 2 or maybe 3 margaritas, we were talking a little bit about the compensation for a host. Locked On, you guys would own the podcast. So how does the performer get paid?
Yeah, I think that's a really important factor of how we're structured. We own all of our podcasts. Everything is Locked On blank. And that's a very different model than most podcast networks where they represent the shows. Hosts come to Locked On. They want to be a part of the Locked On network because we can offer so much as a network to support that host, whether that's the brand recognition, support and distribution efforts. But when it comes to monetization, it's really your opportunity to make this either a full-time job or just part of your sports broadcast portfolio. The larger your audience is, the larger share of revenue that you're able to take. So if you can grow your audience, if you can lean into what it takes to be great, bring in your audience for that sports team, you have the opportunity to grow your income. We definitely have podcast hosts that do this as a part-time job. We also have hosts that do this full-time, and have been able to support themselves and their families, buy homes, send their kids to the school they want to. It's really incredible. It is what you make it with Locked On.
I've seen some numbers from the Toronto Maple Leafs. I've seen numbers from the LA Lakers, and they're astronomically awesome, probably because they got big followings. But then I look at a team like the Jacksonville Jaguars. So, I mean, is it safe to say that the person in LA is going to wind up with a much bigger check and a bigger house than the person who's doing the Locked On Jags podcast?
That's one way of looking at it, definitely.
No, I don't mean to single out your Jags person here, but I'm just comparing markets.
He's amazing too. It really is what you make it. We sell as a network. I think that's what's really important to understand. We don't sell individual shows ever. We sell the Locked On NFL network, the NBA network. And those shows collectively compete with some of the biggest shows in the country. And while, yes, the LA Lakers podcast host might be making more, the Locked On Jaguars host is making more as part of the Locked On network than they ever could as a standalone local podcast. And I think that's one of the really unique factors of joining the Locked On network. I saw a recent report from Acast and Magellan that reported that 44% of advertising spend goes to the top 500 shows. How would the local Jacksonville Jaguar hosts ever make money? How would they ever compete with those top 500 shows? The answer is Locked On, is joining the Locked On network, right? So individually, they would never compete with the top 500 shows. It would be very hard to monetize that individual show. However, when they join the collective Locked On NFL network, the Locked On NFL network is in fact a top 10 sports podcast every day. And so collectively, together, it's not about the Lakers host making more money, or that obviously we're crossing sports here, but it's not about one host making more money than another. It's they are all taking part in making money. They are all getting a piece of the pie that I don't think that they would truly see without being part of our larger network.
So what if they bring a sponsor to the table?
Tremendous. We will handle them with care. There is definitely a difference between local sponsors and national sponsors. If you are a host that can go out and sell as well and bring a local sponsor onto your show, you take a much bigger piece of that pie for sure. We make sure that all of our hosts have the resources to be successful, whether that's them going out and selling their own show to a local sponsor. Our host of Locked On Auburn does an absolutely phenomenal job of doing that. Or if you just want to turn over the responsibilities of monetization to our sales team, we'll do all the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, so sales idea, whether it be Lowe's or Home Hardware or Home Depot, tables, target them to Buffalo Bills fans. They need them every Sunday, right?
They do. They're going to go through some plastic tables, that's for sure.
Do you ever come to any difficult decisions when it comes to really big market teams or teams that travel well, like the Packers and the Cowboys? I mean, how many Cowboys podcasts can you have? How many Packers podcasts can you have?
We only lean into one, right? So we will only have one primary Locked On Packers show. And we put all our resources to that becoming the number one Packers podcast in the country, especially in their market. We lean into marketing and promotion and distribution efforts. Our parent company, Tegna, has innovated the way that we distribute and build our hosts' credibility, whether that's opportunities for being on linear TV, actually on a Tegna news station, or distributing their podcast on OTT or CTV or Fast TV. We are giving every possible resource to our hosts to grow themselves as a sports personality and improve their reach for that podcast. So we don't want to muddy the waters. We don't want 3 Packers podcasts. We want one Packers podcast, and it's going to be the best Packers podcast in the country.
And how often are they obligated to produce a show?
Every day, all year long, Monday through
Wow.
Friday. That's a big part of becoming a Locked On host, is buying into this and really committing. It is 5 days a week, 30-minute episodes. Every show is 20 to 30 minutes in length always. And Monday through Friday, there is a slight off season. There's about a month in every off season where we come down to 3 shows a week. Outside of that very short hiatus window, all of our shows are Monday through Friday, which is pretty impressive to have over 200 shows producing every single day. It's a lot to manage.
Transcription of the Sound Off podcast is powered by the Podcast Super Friends, 5 podcast producers who get together to discuss podcasting. Sharpen your podcast and creation skills by following the show on the Sound Off Podcast YouTube or Facebook page. The Sound Off Podcast supports Podcasting 2.0, so feel free to send us a boost if you're listening on a newer podcast app. If you don't have a newer podcast app, you can get one at newpodcastapps.com.
So I went and zeroed in on the market that I'm in right now. That happens to be Winnipeg. Indeed, there is a Locked On Winnipeg Jets. And indeed, it is producing content every day. As we are recording this, it is July. What could you possibly be talking about? And again, that's Harrison Lee who's doing it, notably based out of Baltimore, also a Caps fan, but he's covering the Winnipeg Jets every single day, doing Locked On with the new episode every day.
As I mentioned, there is a common misconception about the engagement or interest in a sport or a team when games are not being played. You think about the NFL, right? April. What's happening in April? The games ended. Super Bowl was in February. The draft. It's the biggest time of the year. Shortly after that, there's trading camps and trade deadlines. I don't know if you're seeing in the news right now of what's happening to running backs in the NFL, with a lot of major running backs not being re-signed and what that means for running backs. The fantasy football drafts are right around the corner. There is a lot to talk about. Training camps, trade deadlines, you name it, whatever sport. There is a lot that goes on in the quote unquote off season. That is what I mean by we are talking to the most passionate fan. The folks listening to the Winnipeg Jets podcast right now, that is the most die-hard Winnipeg Jets listener or fan that you can possibly speak to. And I think that that's one of the most important factors, especially when we talk to advertisers about who we're reaching. This is a leaned in audience. This is the most passionate fan that you can reach. And so there's plenty to talk about, right? Outside of maybe what you'd think as tentpole headlines.
Yeah. And I think with the diminishing of sports radio in Canada, I mean, this is just absolutely perfect. I mean, I hated listening to radio and hearing them break down the third line power play or the third line center and who's going to be on the fourth line and all that crazy stuff. But it's really, the perfect place to be doing it is on a podcast.
What's been very interesting is the trend that we've seen lately of a lot of broadcast networks starting to not lean into local sports coverage, which I think opens the door wide open for Locked On to become the go-to destination for local sports fans looking to engage with their team. One of the challenges for a really passionate sports fan listening to sports radio is not knowing what you're going to hear. Legendary KNBR, San Francisco. I'm a diehard 49ers fan, but I am not a Warriors fan. When I turn on KNBR, I don't want to be met with updates on Steph Curry and the Warriors. I don't want to sit through listening to updates on baseball and basketball. I want to hear about what's going on with my 49ers. And that's the key difference between Locked On and traditional sports talk radio is that you get exactly what you're looking for when you want it. There's no fluff. This is really high quality sports talk for the sports fan. And so you come to us and you get exactly what you're looking for.
So you've also got Locked On Atlanta, Locked On Cleveland, Locked On the Bay Area. These are podcasts that are really dealing with, the entire market. So a little bit different. First of all, why those cities? And secondly, how's the structure different for those particular shows?
That's a new strategy for us called the Locked On City model. We are leaning into some of the most passionate sports markets in the country that have many teams for sports fans to engage with. That coincides also with Tegna markets that are really important, right? So Cleveland, something that we're leaning into with our innovative distribution methods is fast TV. If you're not familiar with fast TV, essentially that's free TV. When you plug in your new Samsung television and you have no apps or anything else downloaded on it, you have a preset list of free television. Chive TV is always my favorite example of fast TV. You know, you turn it on and it's 24/7. In these markets, we're able to lean into fast TV and have all of those podcasts on there. Actually, they are produced on linear television as well, in some cases for Tegna TV stations. So this is just kind of next level sports broadcast, podcast, television. It's kind of the culmination of everything you want as a sports fan in one place.
Tell me about YouTube and video and I mean, I think a lot of sports podcasts probably, I mean, some of them could have started out on YouTube and then say, oh, look, we can put the audio in as an RSS feed. How do you look at the relationship between video and audio? Because I know with audio, we can put the programmatic ads in, but now you've got some video. So how do you handle that?
We might need to circle back to programmatic. I have some thoughts on that, but video has become very important for us. I spoke with Brian Levine recently, who's our director of production, just about the importance of video and what we're doing lately. We've leaned into it much more in the last year and a half. I think the relationship, the differences between video and audio are really the opportunity to connect on a more personal level with your listeners, right? We think of our own industry, right? We could talk over the phone and over emails for however long, but the moment you meet in person, it's a more deeper, more meaningful connection. You know, our hosts have the opportunity to brand themselves, brand their personalities, and you put your face out there. You're inviting listeners into your studio, and with that, you can create a deeper, more meaningful connection. And I think that that's the power of video, just from a listener standpoint, is connecting on that next level. The video also has helped improve distribution and marketing in a sense, but more distribution in that YouTube is the fastest growing platform right now. And so, like I said, we meet our listeners where they are. And so I think if you're not using YouTube, if you're not using video, you're just missing out on a massive portion of listeners that are there, ready, hungry for the content. It's just about meeting them in their environment. And that's what video allows us to do with YouTube, whether that's on YouTube or, as I mentioned, OTT and CTV.
So what are those thoughts you had on programmatic that you want to share?
It's been an interesting path down programmatic. I remember last year at Podcast Movement, that was the buzzword, programmatic. It was everywhere. It felt like the only thing anybody was talking about. I've gone down the path. I've explored it, right, of monetization. I think, I refer back to the Acast and Magellan report about podcast revenue only reaching the top 500. I think that there has been this narrative that programmatic will help the little guy. That is how podcasters outside the top 500 are going to start seeing revenue. And that's how we're going to get to a $10 billion industry, right? Is through programmatic. But I think that narrative is slightly skewed towards like larger publishers. In order to really see programmatic revenue, you do need to be a part of a larger publishing network, right? The host of Locked on Auburn wouldn't go seek out programmatic ad revenue on their own. They wouldn't have the resources as a local host. But then when you're a part of a larger network, even still, the CPMs are so low, the revenue is distributed so widely across thousands of shows that it's really hard for the little guy to see any sort of meaningful revenue. And so I think that there's just this misconception that programmatic advertising is to the benefit of all of the shows outside of the top 500. I'm not so sure that to be true. I think that programmatic will be valuable to the top 5, top 10 publishers, and it will help improve advertising adoption for brands like Procter & Gamble who need those data points and are looking to kind of transition from traditional digital advertising into our new space. I just think that we need to be careful about how we position it, how we talk to hosts about the value of programmatic. Still today, the best podcast advertising that will drive the most revenue, that drives the highest rate, that performs at the highest level continues to be the host-read ad read.
Fascinating. Because I always thought that maybe Locked On would have their hand in some programmatic in some capacity, but I'm going to guess that you're in charge of 100% of the inventory of the network. And the clients that you're chasing, if you were to open up the programmatic tab, they would just find a very low CPM to come in and take your inventory as opposed to you charging a proper CPM, correct?
It's a great question. We are available on programmatic. We have gone down that route. I went to the same school as Tomas Rodriguez from the trade desk. And so, it's definitely been an area of interest that we've pursued, but I think it's a different advertiser, right? And it's a different campaign in its entirety. Programmatic is, I think it was Marshall from Ad Results that said the live host read ad continues to be beachfront property. At Locked On, we've kind of talked about it that a programmatic ad is, sure, you're going to have a seat for the game, but you're in the nosebleeds when you buy a programmatic ad. When you buy a live read, you're in the lower bowl. You have floor seats, right? The quality of the ad is so important. There was a report recently that stated that creative was the most important factor in an ad campaign. So the value of programmatic advertising versus traditional host read, there are a few different channels for creative. Sounds Profitable recently published an article saying 51% of agencies mark quality of ad creative as the most important factor when choosing podcast partners. Locked On is available in programmatic, but that's going to be your nosebleed seats, right? That is going to be the last available unit in our waterfall of ads, right? So the priority levels, first our internal host read live reads, and then it continues to go down from there from our premium ad partners like Megaphone that will serve digital ad insertion into our network, all the way down the waterfall to programmatic. And even if you buy our network programmatically, that does not guarantee you the opportunity to run on our network. So I think when advertisers are looking at programmatic, it has to be a very small piece of the pie of how they will tap into podcasting. If you just want to be on podcasting, you want some data points, it's available, it's there, but it's not premium podcast advertising. That's not why advertisers should be coming to podcasts to advertise. Locked On does an incredible job. It's one of the things I'm most proud of here is our creative and how we've worked with brands to develop creative that really holistically integrates their creative into our shows for our listeners in a very authentic way.
So I know you know the Miami market. And it was just a few days ago that Lionel Messi signs a big contract in front of people who there's not even a game going on. I mean, is soccer something you're going to be looking at the network?
Soccer is something that we have talked about. I think the most important factor when Locked On considers a new channel is its appeal or opportunity to stay local. That continues to be our driving factor, is local. We are the number one local sports podcast network, and we will continue to hold that position. I've talked about golf. I'm a big golfer. How do we produce a podcast around golf? But there's no sense of local to golf. Soccer, as MLS continues to explode onto the scene in the last few years, I think that there could be an opportunity there. It's definitely something that we've discussed, and I think that there's demand from both the listener and the advertiser with interest in soccer. Messi certainly brings a bit of a wow factor to MLS for the first time in a while.
Well, I'm not going to put any pressure on you or the company to, open up a European division and start to cash in on all the popularity of those Champions League teams. But has anybody talked about that?
Yes and no. I think that David Locke would definitely be a little bit more in tune with what's going on from production concepts than myself, candidly. I try to keep my head very focused on improving our brand partnerships improving our product, the quality of our ad capabilities, our revenue channels, and I leave the creative to the creative minds at work, predominantly David Locke, our founder, and our channel managers, and as well as Carl Weinstein, our COO, and Kylie Young, our head of ad operations, who's been a part of the network since the beginning. So it's a team effort when we come up with things like that.
A very kind and diplomatic response. All you had to say was, that's not my department. As we look towards Denver and podcast movements coming up, what are some of the things that are going through your mind that you really want answers to? Is it monetization? Is it going to be technological? What's the one thing that may keep you up a little bit at night that you're saying, I hope I get the answer to that in Denver?
I think that there's a couple of trends that I've been paying attention to the most. First is ad recovery. I think that we've all been closely tracking the recovery of the ad market. We've seen digital audio come back in. I know I saw BIA's local advertising forecast predicted the ad recovery to take up until 2027, with auto and technology not recovering until 2025. I think that we're already seeing a resurgence in the ad market. Things like Horizon forming a dedicated podcast division, or Group M's forecasting digital ad revenue growing 10% in 2023. I'm feeling pretty bullish on the opportunities ahead for the ad industry. When you get into podcast movement and you have an opportunity to engage with other publishers, hear how things are going for them, what trends that they've seen. Thomas Mancusi has always been an incredible resource. I've worked with him. I know Thomas Mancusi since my days at CBS. It's interesting when you talk with other podcasters and other publishers to hear what they're seeing. At the same time, having the opportunity to connect with brands, agencies, and advertisers to hear what they're looking for and what they want to see in the next year or two from the podcast landscape. I think one of the other big trends that I've seen that will be very interesting, and I think possibly palpable at podcast movement, is the changes that we've seen from some of the biggest podcast publishers as it relates to local sports coverage. Some of those publishers have cut back significantly on their local sports podcast coverage, where Locked On has doubled down on local. So it'll be interesting to see where sports continues to fit in. I know that podcast sports was recently the overtook news as the number one revenue category in podcasting. So it's just an interesting trend to see where sports is right now. And, I'm pretty excited about the opportunity to go into podcast movement as the number one local sports podcast network.
So you see the numbers and every city's reputation when it comes to sports. What's the one market in the U.S. that you could tell me has so much sports activity, I would be floored or surprised to know that city is punching above its weight when it comes to sports?
The demand for local sports, Minnesota is another one. I think when you look at our city model, there's your answer, right? We lean into the markets that have the highest demand for local sports content, the most rabid fan base. Vegas is also an interesting one from my perspective, just because they keep stealing all of our San Francisco teams. That market continues to grow with new sports teams. I think that they were just making a play at a new NHL team in Vegas as well. What was it? Maybe baseball, MLB. They were looking to add a team. So it's crazy what Vegas is doing, investing in stadiums and arenas. And so, but I think Minnesota and Cleveland are sleepers when it comes to the most diehard sports fans. Atlanta as well is a really good one.
Bryan, looking forward to seeing you again at Podcast Movement and carry on. Anybody who wants to get involved with Locked On and possibly become a podcast and work with you, all the information's in the show notes of this episode.
I appreciate you having me, Matt. I'm really looking forward to seeing you next month.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.